Hello and welcome to the channel Phantom Era, where we talk about everything from the weird and wacky to the educational and downright preposterous. Have you ever heard of a disease that affects someone's psyche so much they become a physical representation of popular biblical figures like Jesus, Paul, or Simon? Well, I hadn't either until recently, and apparently it's called Jerusalem Syndrome. Jerusalem syndrome is a disease not recognized in the DSM 5, yet it persists and affects people of multiple nationalities, religions, and genders. So, what exactly is it? How do you catch it? And is it fixable? If you stick around through this video, all of your questions will be answered. And while you're at it, please consider subscribing. As the name implies, Jerusalem syndrome originated in Jerusalem and is considered a group disorder as it can be experienced by anyone who's visited the city. Simply put, the syndrome is a mental phenomenon that involves religiously obsessive ideas, delusions, psychosis, and other similar symptoms. The disease itself was first described in the 1930s by a psychologist in Jerusalem, Heinz Hermann, who became one of the founders for psychological research in Jerusalem. Some argue that while the phenomenon is named Jerusalem syndrome, it's actually occurred in other religious places, such as Rome. The symptoms extend all the way back to the Middle Ages, based on some reports like that of Felix Fabry and the biography of Marjorie Kemp. For those who don't know, Felix Fabry was a Swiss Dominican theologian who created detailed descriptions of his religious pilgrimages. As for Marjorie Kemp, she was a Christian mystic, presumably plagued by visions and, quote-unquote, called to be more intimate with Christ, compared to other religious individuals. Essentially, she was able to converse with God in ways that others weren't. Her visions and episodes were said to be severe, affecting her physical senses and causing her to hear disembodied music or smell unknown scents. As cool as this sounds, it's likely that Marjorie Kemp suffered from mental illness and psychosis, or some type of schizophrenia. Now, back to Jerusalem syndrome. Some psychologists argue that Jerusalem syndrome specifically affects those with underlying conditions, namely mental health problems. This is still under debate as it's hard to document whether or not people affected by the syndrome have had prior diagnoses or not. In any given instance, it's possible someone is completely normal cognitively. Or in other instances, they simply don't know they have some type of underlying mental illness, such as anxiety, depression, and more, which means it's unlikely we'll ever have a true answer as to whether or not Jerusalem syndrome sits within one specific group of people or one specific mental illness. Because of this, Jerusalem syndrome presents itself in a few different ways, which also lends to its complexity and ability to be studied. The basic synopsis of Jerusalem syndrome is as follows. Quote, the classic Jerusalem syndrome occurs when a visit to Jerusalem triggers an intense religious psychosis that resolves quickly after or on departure. End quote. The syndrome itself doesn't appear to last for extensive periods of time, but there are enough differences that 3 types of Jerusalem syndrome have been recognized along with subtypes. Type 1 is described as Jerusalem syndrome imposed on a previous psychotic illness. In other words, this type of Jerusalem syndrome affects those diagnosed or predisposed to psychotic disorders who go to Jerusalem due to religious ideas, religious missions, or another goal in mind. Due to the extensive religious presence surrounding Jerusalem, Type 1 Jerusalem syndrome sufferers adopt aspects of Christian religion, believing they are specific biblical figures or can cause specific biblical events, such as the second coming of Christ. Type 1, subtype 1, is listed as a psychotic identification with biblical characters. Individuals who suffer this subtype identify with biblical characters from the Old and New Testament, so much so that they themselves believe they're these biblical characters reincarnated. Interestingly, Jewish tourists seem to identify more with Old Testament biblical characters, while Christians tend to identify with New Testament characters. Additionally, men and women tend to identify with biblical characters of the same gender. In one particular representation of this subtype, a man in his 40s identified with the biblical figure of Samson. This was a result of his physical fitness journey, which eventually morphed into an intense compulsion to go visit Israel and prove he was Samson to those around him by moving a large piece of stone in the Wailing Wall that he claimed was misplaced. This man was consequently arrested and placed in a hospital following the commotion of his attempted stone removal. When a psychiatrist told the man he wasn't Samson, the man became so angry that he broke a window and escaped the hospital, where he was later found at a bus stop by a student nurse. Smarter than the psychiatrist on staff, She told the man he'd proven himself to be Samson and that he should return to the hospital, which he did of his own accord. From there, he was given antipsychotics after being assessed. His psychotic state eased and he was able to fly home under the supervision of his father. Type 1, subtype 2, is listed as individuals who strongly identify with an idea based on a religious nature. In one instance, a Protestant South American concocted a plan to travel to Jerusalem and destroy Muslim holy places and religious structures in order to replace them with Jewish structures and holy places. From there, this individual would start the war of Gog and Magog, leading to the birth of the Antichrist and the second coming of Jesus. After successfully ruining a holy mosque in Jerusalem, the man was admitted to a hospital and later transferred to a mental health institution in his home country. Type 1, subtype 3, is listed as medical ideas regarding health in connection to holy places. For instance, people with horrible illnesses firmly believe that visiting Jerusalem will heal them of any ailment they possess. Interestingly, a man from the mid-1800s known as the writer Gorgol was one of these individuals. After losing his ability to write, he firmly believed that going to Jerusalem and reciting prayers in holy places would heal him, restoring his ability to write. This idea consumed him, but it didn't work, and he later reportedly starved himself to death. Type 1, subtype 4 is listed as family problems culminating in psychosis in Jerusalem. The description for this subtype listed in Barr et al. Is a little confusing to understand, so I'm going to summarize it as best as I can. When people with mental illness attend Jerusalem, their psychosis can manifest into creating non-existent family problems. Alternatively, the psychosis can exacerbate family problems that already exist. The people that fit within this subtype often go to Jerusalem multiple times, thinking that the holy place is either the cause or solution to their perceived familiar problems. An example for this subtype occurred when a South African man diagnosed with bipolar disorder and with a history of hospital visits due to his mental health visited Jerusalem. His reason for visiting was to kill a man that had reportedly raped his daughter. With a warning from his family to Jerusalem authorities, the man was placed in hospital upon arrival and was promptly treated for his psychosis. After his mental state steadied, he was able to understand the fact that his mental state had been manic and that he actually didn't intend on killing anyone in Jerusalem. He also acknowledged that his daughter had never been raped and that he was actually thinking of his son-in-law, who he had no issue with and actually admired. Interestingly, this wasn't the first time the man had sought out Jerusalem to solve his manic episodes, that often created distortions of his family life and family dynamics. It's still unclear why people like him are even drawn to Jerusalem to overcome these types of episodes, yet it happens. Type 2 is described as Jerusalem syndrome superimposed on and complicated by idiosyncratic ideas. This version pertains to individuals that don't suffer psychosis or underlying mental illness, but are heavily religious individuals who put a lot of importance, emotional, and spiritual energy into the significance of Jerusalem. This can lead to obsessions surrounding Jerusalem as their ideas and beliefs are heightened. Type 2 subtype 1 is defined as individuals who belong to a group. This subtype doesn't contain one specific example, but is best explained as follows. Individuals who fit into this subtype are usually part of small Christian groups outside of the mainstream denominations of Christianity. The groups rarely consist of more than 20 people and often make their homes in or around Jerusalem. They do this to try and bring forth the second coming of Christ or trigger other biblical events. Many of these groups and members wear clothing that's supposed to resemble accurate representations of clothing in the Bible. On top of these niche Christian groups, a handful of Jewish-based groups, at least 3, exist in and around Jerusalem. Their intentions are to create a red heifer. It is believed that sacrificing a pure red heifer can be used for purification rituals that allows individuals to enter the temple. A pure red heifer has yet to be conceived. In most cases, these individuals don't undergo psych evaluations as they are harmless to those around them. Type 2, subtype 2 is a classification for lone individuals, wherein a single person becomes obsessed with Jerusalem and its religious implications. Similar to the grouping type listed above, except it's a lone wolf. For example, a 45-year-old German man working in academics became obsessed with finding what he called, quote, the true religion, but was disappointed regardless of the religion he studied. He ultimately decided that, quote, primitive Christianity was a true religion and became obsessed with spreading the word specifically through Jerusalem. This led to a violent altercation, and the man still clings to this obsession. When studied by local psychologists, they found absolutely nothing wrong with him, not even a personality disorder. All he had was his obsession with true religion and Jerusalem. Type 3 is described as Jerusalem syndrome in a discrete form uncompounded by previous mental illness. This is perhaps the best known condition, wherein a seemingly normal person sound of mind develops psychosis upon arrival in Jerusalem, and can even feel that certain governments or agencies are after them due to their newfound religious significance. So, how prevalent is the condition amongst tourists? Well, statistically speaking, it's pretty insignificant. Over the span of 13 years, about 1,200 tourists developed some version of Jerusalem syndrome, 470 of which were admitted to a hospital for their condition. While that sounds like a lot, remember it's a total of 1,200 over the span of 13 years. Additionally, Jerusalem sees about 3.5 million tourists a year, so as I stated, it's pretty insignificant. What makes type 3 even more interesting is that it's very different from types 1 and 2 in the same sense that it has no subtypes, but instead specific criteria and stages. The first criteria is that subjects suffering from type 3 Jerusalem syndrome have no previous history of mental illness or psychotic episodes. Essentially, they're as neurotypical as anyone can be. The second criteria is that individuals aren't driven by a mission or purpose like types 1 and 2. It's not to find the true religion, cause an apocalyptic event, become a biblical character, or heal some terminal illness. Instead, these are normal tourists there to visit a historical site without special consideration to its religious significance. The third and final criteria is that once these individuals arrive in Jerusalem, they suffer an acute psychotic episode that typically manifests in a series of 7 steps or stages. The following stages are described word for word by Bar El et al. Symptom 1. Anxiety, agitation, nervousness, and tension, plus other unspecified reactions. 2. Declaration of the desire to split away from the group or the family and to tour Jerusalem alone. Tourist guides aware of the Jerusalem syndrome and of the significance of such declarations may at this point refer the tourist to our institution for psychiatric evaluation in an attempt to preempt the subsequent stages of the syndrome. If unattended, these stages are usually unavoidable. 3. A need to be clean and pure, obsession with taking baths and showers, compulsive fingernail and toenail cutting. 4. Preparation, often with the aid of hotel bed linen, of a long ankle-length toga-like gown, which is always white. 5. The need to scream, shout, or sing out loud psalms, verses from the Bible, religious hymns, or spirituals. Manifestations of this type serve as a warning to hotel personnel and tourist guides, who should then attempt to have the tourist taken for professional treatment. Failing this, the last 2 stages will develop. 6. A procession or march to one of Jerusalem's holy places. 7. Delivery of a sermon in a holy place. The sermon is usually very confused and based on an unrealistic plea to humankind to adopt a more wholesome, moral, simple way of life. So, how do you survive Jerusalem syndrome? Well, most people fall under type 3 and don't experience visual or auditory hallucinations like types 1 or 2 can. In fact, most of the time, people return to normal within 5 to 7 days. If you have underlying health concerns or psychotic issues, psychiatric help is the best form of treatment. In most cases, when people recover from their Jerusalem syndrome, they're able to remember and recall their behaviors, often extremely embarrassed by their actions. It is important to note, however, that while most Jerusalem syndrome cases are harmless to others, save a few, it can be very detrimental to your own health. So much so that the psychosis can cause you to abandon common sense, like that of Oliver McAfee, a 29-year-old British tourist who remains missing to this day. Reports state that McAfee likely developed a severe case of Jerusalem syndrome that led him to vanishing off the face of the earth. A devout Christian, McAfee reportedly disappeared in the Negev desert of Israel. When hikers found McAfee's wallet, laptop, and keys, they handed the items over to authorities, which prompted a search. Reports state that amongst items later found belonging to McAfee was a Bible with torn pages and a series of notes. The pages and notes specifically pertain to the story of Jesus wandering the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, where he was tempted by the devil but ultimately triumphed. This made investigators believe that not only had McAfee fallen victim to Jerusalem syndrome, but that he deliberately walked out into the desert, presumably to replicate the Bible story. Remains were found in 2021, but no developments have been made regarding McAfee, and the remains have not been ID'd as his. McAfee officially went missing in 2017, though some articles indicate it was 2018. This is likely due to the fact that McAfee was last seen November 21st at the end of the year, and was expected home in December before the new year, meaning that depending on established timelines, the events could overlap, as no one knows exactly when McAfee vanished. Now, as scary of a situation as that is, in recent years, cases of Jerusalem syndrome have gone down. Where in previous years 50 cases were seen by the Israeli hospitals, only about 2 to 3 occur each year in present day. It just so happened that McAfee was one of the small statistics. meaning that you are likely to visit Jerusalem and come out the other side just fine. However, it's important to recognize the illness both to protect yourself and others. You never know who it could happen to, even if it isn't you. You could help a loved one from falling victim to psychosis in the way McAfee likely did. Overall, Jerusalem syndrome is relatively harmless, save a few extreme cases. What makes the syndrome so difficult is that its occurrence is something of a mystery, as research struggles to understand what exactly causes obsessions and psychotic breaks surrounding the city of Jerusalem. It's likely we'll never get an answer, and in truth, it's unnerving to come to terms with. Some people may choose to believe that it's the trauma of the city manifesting itself, sort of like a haunting but spiritual, and some may choose to believe that it's just a religious awakening. Anyone can speculate all they want, but science is still baffled, which means we'll be left grasping for straws. Just know if you go to Jerusalem, it's better to be safe than sorry. Keep an eye out for yourself and others, or you just might fall victim to one of the world's strangest syndromes. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like or a comment and subscribe if that floats your boat. I'm attempting a new video format, so let me know down in the comments how you like it. Stay safe out there and take care of each other, and I will see all of you guys in the next video.